In the era of fast media, the art of storytelling is often overshadowed by the need to turn and burn, feeding an insatiable mass unchecked and meaningless fact just to keep the machine churning. Tommy Hyde stands in opposition to this notion. Hiding behind his lens for the better part of a decade, he allowed a story to unfold uninfluenced by opinion or deadlines, with intrigue as his only driver. Today on Cocina Pirata Podcast, Tommy joins me to discuss evolution through creation, finding meaning in subjects perceived as mundane, and how we move forward using stewards of the land as our guide.
Contra la muerte nosotros demandamos vida. Contra el silencio exigimos la palabra y el respeto. Contra el olvido, la memoria. Contra la humillación y el desprecio, la dignidad. Contra la opresión, la rebeldía. Contra la esclavitud, la libertad. Contra la imposición, la democracia. Y contra el crimen, la justicia.
Cheers to
foam micheladas.
So I do want to start actually asking you, are you from Vermont?
No, an adopted Vermonter. I grew up in Connecticut in what I like to call the Panhandle. You know, Connecticut's like a square.
Yeah.
And there's just that little nub.
Yep.
Off the bottom, the Panhandle. I grew up there. And then my grandma lived in Vergennes growing up.
Okay.
So I came up here every summer. And
Did your mom grow up in Vergennes?
No. My great grandma and great grandpa used to hang at, do you know the Basin Harbor Club?
Yeah,
in Vergennes?
Absolutely.
They hung out there, and then my grandma hung out there, and then my mom hung out there, and then I hung out there. There was just like a family spot.
Just coming up from Connecticut.
Yeah, in the summers. And I just loved it. And then I went to camp in Salisbury, like canoe tripping camp. And then I went to college here, and then I moved here. And then I tried to leave to go to the West Coast like 4 or 5 times, and I just always come back.
Yeah.
It's not a unique story.
I mean, it kind of is. The funny part of that story is Connecticut. Like, there's so many people from Connecticut that I meet now. My mom's family. My mom grew up in Connecticut. My grandmother is from. Her maiden name is Barton, or was Barton. So she's from the Northeast Kingdom, and I guess they moved to Connecticut, and that's where my mom grew up. But I've met a lot of people from Connecticut up here. Connecticut is actually apparently where this Miller infatuation comes from.
Oh, really?
Because my mom asked me when I was telling her that Bob drinks Miller, she was like, "Oh, is he from there?" Because they drank Miller High Life growing up.
Well, they say that, I heard this recently, that Connecticut is the land of steady habits, which just, if you spent any time in Connecticut, it fits so perfectly. People there get on a trajectory, or they're into their Miller High Life, and that's just steady.
I've never been. So we've like driven through Connecticut. Obviously, I've driven through Connecticut. My mom's from Enfield, and so I think one time we made like this. I don't even know where the fuck Enfield is, but I feel like Connecticut is the place on the East Coast that you just don't know anything. Like what happens in, maybe that's the steady trajectory, but like what happens in Connecticut?
It's a really good question. Not a whole lot. I mean, in the context of New England, there's not like a, it's not Rhode Island. It doesn't have like the coast and Providence. It's not Massachusetts. It doesn't have Boston. Like there's no big city. There's no like big natural wonder there. And so it sort of flies under the radar. But I, for all of the shit that I give my hometown, relatively like homogeneous place, suburbs of New York. Like when I go back there now, not a lot of interesting stuff going on. I consistently meet funky people who are coming from Connecticut who you'd never think that they're from the landy steady habits, but they've broken out and they're doing cool things. And there's a lot of awesome people in Connecticut too. But Vermont feels like the adopted home.
And all of your family is in Connecticut still?
Yeah. Yeah. For the most part, my dad's in North Carolina now, and my brother's in New York City. But everyone has the Vermont sort of soul heart connection for sure.
Well, maybe what makes people young people interesting coming out of Connecticut is just the steady habits. They're ready to break free from them.
Yeah. Maybe that's it.
Did film start for you there in Connecticut?
No. I started doing film in college. I took a freshman year class. Middlebury had this thing where they do, in January, you take one full class, but that's the only thing you take for an entire month. And so I took this class, adventure writing and digital storytelling. And I got assigned with a buddy to basically go out and hang out with a local and write a story and make a little video about them. And our professor told us about this dairy farmer on the outskirts of town. So we drove out there and got out of the car, and we had cameras, and this farmer, without knowing who we were, introduced himself. He's like, "Hey, I'm Doug. Come with me," and just starts like giving us a tour of his farm. And next thing you know, we are covered head to toe in cow shit and are doing things that we never, from my sheltered upbringing in Connecticut, would have never imagined ever doing. But was also connecting, the coolest part of my summer every year was going to the Addison County Fair. Have you been to the Addison County Field Days?
I haven't, but the cleaning guy here has been telling me about the Addison County Field Days.
Yes, he knows. It's the truth, man. It's like all of the beautiful, Vermont farm culture on display. Biggest squash competitions, and they have the whole 4-H program, the demo derby, and going there every summer was like, it totally blew my fucking mind as a kid, because everyone was the same in Connecticut. It was a town where Darien was a town where it was like weird to wear jeans. Like everyone wore khakis. Like that's the sort of level of boringness we're talking about. So the Addison County Field Days is like, holy shit, there's like different people in this world. And so it sort of clicked for me pretty quickly, like, oh, like this is one of those dudes. So we made like a shitty 2-minute film about him, and I wrote a piece about him. But then Doug and I just stayed friends. And he talked about this, when we were there that month, this dream he had of taking his dogs. Like that's the reason why the professor sent us out there in the first place, because he was unique in that he had a dog sled team, like behind his farmhouse, basically.
Yeah.
100 dogs behind his farmhouse. And he told us about, this plan he had to go to Alaska and race his dogs in the sprint racing championships of the world. And the way he talked about it, it sounded like he was going that year. But then slowly over the years, I realized like, oh, Doug isn't going to Alaska. And not only that, he's literally at the age of 65, never left his farm for more than 5 days in his entire life. Like he's never seen the ocean.
So wild.
And so it just struck me like, wow, wouldn't it be so cool to like see him go to Alaska? Like, what would that look like?
Yeah.
And so that started this whole 10-year process of making a feature film about Doug.
Yeah, how old are you now?
30.
And you started you met Doug at 18-ish.
I met him at 19.
19.
Yeah.
And that's the subject of the pending documentary. Has it been released yet? Or?
Yeah. Well, it's finished, and we're like in the process of releasing it right now.
That's crazy. And so is the content gathering started at 19 and has continued throughout the years from this relationship and this want to see Doug go to Alaska?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, I pretty much threw out 7 years of footage or 6 years of footage because it was basically unusable. Because I never really took a film class. I just sort of had a haphazard amalgamation of borrowed equipment, and I'd just sort of walk over and I'd film, and then I'd edit a little bit and continue to make mistakes. And so none of that footage was really usable, but what was happening in all that time was the film was developing a look and feel. I was developing a style, and I was also starting to blend into the wallpaper around the farm and around Doug and around Doug's family. And so really interesting things started to happen. Like the walls started to come down. And I mean, you're from rural Vermont, the like sort of flinty toughness where it can be tough to get, the farmer from down the road to talk about his feelings. And yet all of a sudden now I'm, in the room when Doug is talking about his depression, and Doug is talking about his thoughts of suicide, and Doug is talking about, like really deep things with his sister, and, and then all these like magical moments of like calves being born, or like the joy of him deer hunting, which he's like a little kid. He's just so outrageously excited. And then the same thing with the dogs, like the toil and the expense of trying to keep this dog team afloat, but then also like the unbridled joy of just ripping behind an 18 dog team, just cruising. And he sings and dances and drinks beer on the back of the dog sled
while it's moving.
Yeah. He'll have like 7 or 8 beers in 45 minutes. He has like different buddies at all these races around the Northeast and in Canada. And he's frequently in last place, but he's the favorite at all these races. And he has people, like his legend sort of precedes him. And there are people at different checkpoints on these races, and they're like clamoring to hand him a beer. And he is not the best at dog racing, but he is amazing at catching a beer on the run and then drinking it. And so, yeah, I guess I was just like, this dude really intrigued me, and I wasn't sure why. And so I just kept filming to try to figure it out.
That's so wild. Like, so to some extent, your career, like at this current state, was inspired by this dude. Totally. And you guys have been on this journey together, but separately to some extent, no?
Totally. Professor Butler. And from the School of Hard Knocks.
And is that dude like, is Doug like family now? Is Doug like a brother, a father?
Totally. As I was making the film too, I started to learn more about like journalistic norms and all that. And, it's especially in print journalism, or sort of more factual journalism, there's a lot more sort of distance that you're supposed to put between you and your subject to remain objective. But I remember listening to a really amazing Werner Herzog interview, who's like my hero in the world of film. And he talked about this idea of like an emotional truth, which is, one that's not based on, the facts exactly as they happened, but rather like the feeling of those facts, like which can only come from like embellishment and theater, and like you can create a truth that's closer to its essence if you're creative in getting there. Yeah. And so part of that process for me was just like developing like a really close relationship to Doug, and like a lot of trust. Like I really commend him for the amount of trust that he put in me to, carry this vulnerability out into the world. And like so much courage and bravery from him to be able to share it.
Do you think that it was, I mean, it seems like from the story you're telling that it was just adopted. Like it wasn't really like that. So when you're explaining, it doesn't seem like what you're doing is reporting. So when you're talking about like journalistic truth and like the essence of life, those two things I don't think go hand in hand. So it's like, maybe it wasn't trust. Maybe that just was maybe that is reality, right? Like you guys just were together so fucking much that it just turned into this situation where you were part of life, and that is reality. Because I feel a lot of times when you watch documentaries, there is an objective, regardless of whether or not it's, impartial or is supposed to be impartial. There's still an objective and like an end to the story. Does it feel difficult telling a story like Doug's story to put like how the fuck do you end something like that with him? The story's not over. I assume Doug's still alive, correct? And you guys still have a relationship. So I guess to me it seems like just seems like a really fucking weird situation to put a pin on, or to say that it's like trust and it's not just like normal life, or that he's giving you trust instead of you just like adapting into his lifestyle. It's like an endless series of events that continues to happen. You can't really, I mean, how do you end it?
Yeah. I mean, it makes you want to make it for 10 years. I think eventually you start, running out of time and money and patience, and you have to sort of put a bow on it. And like, it's also sort of like an artistic journal entry, and, being able to like, finish it and move on to different things has been great. But, it's true. Like the more you hang around, the more life happens, and then the more interesting things happen. Originally I thought, so we did end up getting to Alaska. So we drove from Middlebury, Vermont to Fairbanks, Alaska, which is 4,800 miles one way.
That's wild. Did you drive like north and then through Canada, or across the country and through like North Dakota?
Like first to Chicago, which is where we saw like the widest eyes, because we were in essentially like a F-350, like a 1980s F-350 with an extended chassis with this big box built on the back with all these kennels with 22 dogs. And so we'd stop and like get gas like outside of O'Hare, and people would be like, who are you people? Like, what is happening? And you'd have to, every 3 hours you have to pull over and bring all the dogs down and clip. They have little sort of chains that connect their collars to the side of the truck so they can all like go to the bathroom in a busy parking lot on the side of I-80.
Yeah.
And then you get back in. So we went through Chicago and then up through North Dakota and then up into like Ontario, Alberta, British Columbia, and then up the Alaskan highway into the Yukon, and then over into Alaska. And the only people who were not surprised to see us were we were just talking about the border, the Quebecois border. The people at the Alaskan border were like, "Hey, where are you guys coming from? You racing? What race you going to in Alaska? Because it's the state sport in Alaska, I guess."
So it's like status quo for them to see.
Yeah, and so Doug's like this outlier in the rest of his life, and we get to Alaska, and it's like everyone dog mushes. It's like totally normal. It was a sweet scene, and Doug's goal was very modest. He just didn't want to come in last.
Yeah.
And he came in second to last.
Sick.
And won. There was one award where all the different teams competing would vote on the person who exemplified the spirit of the sport the best. You could call it a sportsmanship award.
Yeah.
And Doug won that.
He's a fucking MVP.
I thought the film would be done at that point.